Today's daf we're going to be learning is Zevachim Daf Mem Bet. This week's daf is sponsored by Aunt Elaine, the Fredges, the Hajages, the Summers, the Greenstones, and Pilchowskis in honor of Lana Kersner's birthday. We admire so much how you continue the Greenstone family legacy of intellectual curiosity coupled with daily dedication to learning and Judaism. Happy birthday. Okay, we're going to get started today with where we ended yesterday. So if you recall, at the end of yesterday's daf, there's also a study guide for today, which will help for a good chunk of the daf, not for the whole thing, but part of it. We started with this, we quoted a Mishna Menachot, which connected back in a kind of almost backwards way, you could say. But it was a Mishnah with a machloket between Rabbi Meir and the rabbis. And the simple reading of that machloket, okay, so let's just go through the machloket. Pigul bekometz v'lo belevona, belevona v'lo bekometz. So we had an issue where you take the kometz, which is the part that you took the handful. The Kohen took a handful really with his 3 middle fingers, takes a handful of the meal offering. That part has to be burned on the altar with frankincense. So when he goes to burn them on the altar, and he's burning the kometz and the levona, and he has a machshavet pigul in one of those actions, but not the other, Rabbi Meir says it's pigul. And there's karet if you were to eat, right? If you were to eat it. Now, the rabbis say there's no karet unless you're mefagel b'kol matir. This is not pigul. Why is it not pigul? Because you didn't have a machshavet pigul in the whole action. This is all considered one action, to burn the parts on the altar, which is, it's the frankincense and the meal offering, and if the komet, the kmitza, and if you didn't burn them both with the same machshavet pigul, it's not going to be pigul. You're not going to get karet for it. Now that's the rabbis. Sorry, Rabbi Meir says it is pigul. Okay, so it seems from first glance, the simple reading of this machloket is the rabbis hold ein mefaglin b'chatzi matir, which is exactly what we had in our Mishnah, if you remember, right? The rabbis said, let's go back to our Mishnah, because all the matanot, now, by the way, today we're going to learn what they talked about in the Mishnah. I didn't really realize this until I studied today's stuff, which is when it says in the Mizbeach HaPnimi, the inner altar, and it says, Natan kulan kitiknam ve'echad shelo kitikna psula ve'em bo karet. It actually means any one of we're going to see today, there's 43 sprinklings of the Kohen Gadol's, the par and the seir. Any one of those, not just the 4 placements. Okay, we're talking about in all the inner altar ones, there's more than the 4 placements. There's the 7 sprinklings. For some, there's 8 times 2 times 4. We're gonna get to them. Okay, what this Mishnah really means is during any one of them, you have a pigul thought. That's not pigul. Okay, why is that not pigul? Because ein mefaglin b'chatzi matir, and that matches exactly what the rabbis say in this Mishnah. The problem is that Rabbi Meir says it's pigul, even though it's only in part of the action. So either we go by the simple reading, which is Rabbi Meir thinks you can have pigul part of an action. So any part of the action a pigul thought is going to ruin your whole korban. Okay? That's Rabbi Meir. But Reish Lakish said that's not Rabbi Meir. And in fact, he understands the Mishnah. He says the Mishnah can't be what we just said. And I'm not going to go through all his proof again, but he basically says Rabbi Meir agrees that mifaglim, the ein mefaglin b'chatzi matir. And the Mishnah matches Rabbi Meir as well. It's not just the rabbi's opinion, it's everyone's opinion. And what he says is, how do you explain this Mishnah in Menachot? Because it must be you had a pigul thought in the beginning and then didn't have any thought in the second part. And his whole theory is that according to Rabbi Meir, it's all based on this line, when you do an action, it goes by your original first action. So if you did one with a pigul machshava and one with a correct machshava, that won't be pigul because they mefaglim b'chatzi matir. But if you did one with a pigul thought and the next one without anything, we assume your second part follows your first. So you have to understand those 2 basic approaches. Okay, one is Reish Lakish. That's the new one we just said, which is it's not a machloket about mefaglin or ein mefaglin b'chatzi matir. That's not the machloket. Everyone agrees, part of an action, that won't mess it up. It's just a matter of if you were silent in the second, will that follow the first? But Rabbi Shmuel bar Yitzchak said, no. And then he explained actually the Mishnah in some other way and got to the fact that the Mishnah is the rabbis, but that basically he says this doesn't have to do with that. And he basically says it is a machloket, mefaglin b'chatzi matir, or not mefaglin, or at least he opens the possibility for that reading. Now, what we're going to do today, structure-wise, it's incredibly simple. We're going to have one difficulty on Reish Lakish, one difficulty on those who disagree with Reish Lakish and say the machloket really is mifaglin or a mifaglin b'chatzi matir. That's going to be on Amud Bet, and one difficulty again on Reish Lakish. Now, what's interesting about this is all the difficulties against Reish Lakish will be left unanswered. We're actually, for the first contradiction, okay, both actually are from a Tosefta, and both sources that we bring against Reish Lakish. So the first one, we're going to have three attempts to resolve it, three completely different attempts of how they're going to read this source to try to read it, this Tosefta, to try to read it to fit in with Reish Lakish, but there's going to be a difficulty raised with every single answer. And same with the second difficulty against Reish Lakish, which is where we're going to end today's daf, is this difficulty which we're going to reject for two reasons. On the other hand, we're going to have a difficulty against the rabbis, against those who disagree with Reish Lakish, presumably Rabbi Shmuel bar Yitzchak, and we're going to resolve that contradiction. And then we're just going to have one very side question for the whole thing, like in the middle of that. Okay, that's our structure. So today, starting at the bottom of Aleph Amud Bet, again, we're quoting from the Tosefta. Okay, we don't know now. What is this talking about? Well, we're in the middle of a sentence. So what comes before? Rashi helps us. This is set up like our Mishnah. When one matana is going to create a pigul situation, what's that situation? This is going to differentiate between the inner altar, outer altar. If you're in the outer altar, since, what did we say? Okay, this isn't really relevant for today's daf, but since one matana is sufficient, therefore, pigul and one matana will be enough because that one matana is the matir. That permits the meat to be burned on the altar, right? So it's a matir and there's pigul in it and we've got Aval damim anitanim al mizbeach hapnimi kigon. Now we're going to have to go on a tangent a bit and understand what all these cases are. 43 sprinklings on Yom Kippur. 11 shapar kohen Mashiach. The 11 of the par kohen Mashiach. The 11 shapar lim davar shel tzibor and the par lim davar shel tzibor. These are the two sin offerings of the Kohen Gadol and the par lim davar shel tzibor from the community sins. We talked about them a lot the last few days. Okay, let's stop for a minute, okay, and let's go to our study guide and we'll go through what are all these 43 and, what are we talking about here? So the 43 of Yom Kippur, okay, we're going to go through this 3/4 stages, okay? And it's important to know there's 4 later because we're going to talk about 4 later, but right now it looks like there's 3. For the Kohen Gadol goes into the Kodesh Kodashim, Holy of Holies. He sprinkles toward the kaporet, right, the cover on the aron, blood from the bull and blood from the goat offering. Okay, so he comes in with the blood of both those offerings. He does, right, that's the achad v'shtayim. What does he do? 1 above and 7 below. Remember, we said that's like you're whipping one kind of further, like a more far shot, and the other 7 closer. So he does that. Okay, and now in our davening, we say it twice, but he actually does it 4 times because if you remember there, the davening says, and then he does the same thing for the other animal. Okay, so basically we're going to have this times 4. We're going to get to 32 because he's going to do. Okay, so now where does he do? He does 2 in the Kodesh HaKodashim of 8, 2 sets of 8, 1 for the par, 1 for the seir. Then in the Heichal, in the inner sanctuary, okay, but not the Kodesh Kodashim. He goes further out, and that's where he faces the parochet, which is the boundary between the Kodesh and the Kodesh Kodashim. And then he sprinkles the blood again of the par and the seir, of the bull and the goat. Again, 1 above, 7 below. So that gets up to 32. Then we go to the inner altar. And the inner altar, the truth is, I have to check. I forgot in the davening whether which one they say, and you do this, right? And he does this. Was it, I can't remember now if he does it on each animal, I think, in that, and then he does it also outside. I forget where the doubling is. I meant to look before class, but I didn't have a chance. So you can look it up in your tefillah and see, and then it says, and thus he would do 4, and doubled it. I just forget which one. Okay, now, you think it's close to Yom Kippur, I remember, but anyway, I forgot. So Mizbeach HaPnimi, now he goes to he's still in the Heichal, but he goes to the altar, right? He's not standing against the parochet. Okay, so we got to 32. Now we get to the altar. And here he does 2 things. And this is why you could call this 3 stages or 4 stages, because you can either split this into 2 or you could say this is all just 1 stage. So the Mizbeach HaPnimi, on that altar, what does he do? First, he does the 4 placements of the blood, and then he does 7 sprinklings on the top of the Mizbeach. So altogether, that's 11. That's how we get to 43. In the Parlim Dever Shel Tzibor and the Par Kohen HaMashiach, I just forgot to write here on the chart that it's also the Par Kohen HaMashiach. He does 11 because he only does the last 11 that we just discussed by the Kohen Gadol. He doesn't do against the Paro. I'm sorry, my mistake. He actually does the 2 middle ones that we have here. He does 7 Keneged HaParochet. Remember, we were darshaning that pasuk, why it says Parochet HaKodesh and why it says Parochet. So he does 7 toward the Parochet and 4 on the corners of the altar. So he doesn't do in Kodesh Kodeshim, obviously, and he doesn't do the 7 that are on the top of the altar. Okay, so he does the 2 in between ones. That's what goes to the Parlim Dever Shel Tzibor. Those 11, and by the way, he doesn't do the 1 lemala. Okay, so he does this stage of the Heichal against the Parochet. Okay, but he doesn't do 8. He does 7 there. Okay, so it's, I guess, differs in a few ways from the Yom Kippurim. So that's the 43 and the 11. Now, so let's stick with our study guide. We'll keep sharing it and see the big chart. So the chart right now, we're going to go through this bright. So what did we do so far? We said in the damim on the Mizbeach HaChitzon, the outer altar, which is totally not our topic right now, you have a pigul thought in one of the placements of the blood, since one is sufficient to make the whole, right, to finish your korbanah, permit the next stage, which is the meat to be burned on the altar, whatever's supposed to be burned, the imurim or the meat, whatever korban it is. The pigul machshava ruins it because that's a complete matir. But going back to the beginning of our source here, at the top of our daf, but if you're in the ones that are going on the inner altar, like the 43 of Yom Kippur, or the 11 of the Par Kohen HaMashiach, or the Parlim Dever Shel Tzibor, okay, now we get to our big thing here. We're going to again have a machloket Rabbi Meir and the rabbis, and look at the case they're having a machloket about. Pigel bein barishona, bein bashniya, bein bashlishi. Now, according to Rashi, okay, Tosefta has a different explanation, but according to Rashi, what's rishona, shniya, and shlishit? Stage 1, Kodesh Kodesh. Okay, now really this refers more to Yom Kippur. Stage 1 in the Kodesh Kodeshim. Stage 2 in the Heichal toward the Parochet. Stage 3 on the Mizbeach HaPnimi, okay, on the altar. So whether you had a pigul machshava in one part or the other, which notice it doesn't make a difference, the order. Okay, you ready? So don't look at the chart yet, just the first column of the chart. Okay, we're in the red, which is the Tanaitic source. After that, we're going to get to the Amoraim who try to translate it. Rabbi Meir Omer pigul v'chayavim alav karet. What do you see here? You could have a pigul machshava at any stage of the placements of the blood. That's why I had to go back and explain our Mishnah properly. Because our Mishnah basically says, if you have at any stage, right, kulan ketikna, but one shalo ketikna, just one pigul, but the rest was done properly, all the rest of all the sprinklings, there's no karet, right? It's not pigul, or even if you added in most of them, right, it's not pigul. So, pigul bein b'rishona, bein b'shniya, bein b'shlishit, Rabbi Meir says it is pigul, and you're chayav karet. Now, this, you can't say this is, he started with pigul and then was silent, because it's not what it says. It says it could be in the first, it could be in the second, it could be in the third. Okay, it's pigul, and you get karet. And the rabbis say, the rabbis say, no, it's only pigul if it's the whole stage. You have to drink through all the 43 for Yom Kippur, all the 11 for the other ones. You have to have a pigul thought. If it's not the whole time, it's not pigul. So now, they just go back and say, this is the line we want you to focus on in case it wasn't obvious. Right? It says, doesn't matter which one, any part of it. Rabbi Meir says it's pigul. The rabbis say it's not. So we have a problem because that seems to be mifaglin b'chatzi matir, mifaglin b'chatzi matir, right? It seems very clear that that's the machloket against Reish Lakish. So like I said, we're going to have 3 different explanations, Rabbi Yitzchak bar Avin, Rava, and Rav Ashi, as to what does this really mean and how can we explain it in a way that doesn't contradict what Reish Lakish said. And that really, okay, again, Reish Lakish says 2 things, which is important. One is, Rabbi Meir agrees that ein mefaglin b'chatzi matir. So you'd have to come up with a case where it's really only one matir. Okay, the whole thing is the pigul happened in the whole matir. It's going to be the first explanation. We're going to try to do that. And he also says that Rabbi Meir holds the kol auseh al dat rishona hu oseh. Now here it doesn't seem to be that there was shtika or not, but maybe we'll try to read that in. That's going to be the next 2 explanations. So I'm Rav Yitzchak Bar Avin. If you didn't understand my side part about what's going to be, don't worry, we're going to get to there. I'm Rav Yitzchak Bar Avin. Hacha b'may askinan. Kigon shepigel b'shchita dechad matirhu. So we're going to resolve this by saying, oh, it really all happened in the slaughtering. And the pigel bein b'rishon bein b'shti bein b'shli doesn't mean what you think it means. It doesn't mean the pigul machshava happened then. Okay, but then I'm going to have to explain what it means. But why we're talking about the blood when it really happened in the slaughtering. It happened during the act of slaughter. So what's Rishon Ashniyan Shlishit? So Rashi helps us out here. Okay, Kigon Shebigel b'shchita right next to it in Rashi. Hak Tika'amar Rabbi Meir Pigel b'shniya pigul is Kigon shenishpach hadam la'achar shenigmar matanot shebifnim. Okay, now here is a whole new situation. And we learned this in Yoma, okay? Rashi reminds us. If, let's say, okay, now we did split this up into stages. There's the blood in the Kodesh Kodeshim, there's the blood in the Heichal, looking toward the Kodesh Kodeshim, and then there's the blood on the altar. What if the blood spilled in between stages? So if you finish the sprinklings inside and then you spill the blood on your way out, okay, the Kohen Gadol spills the blood, you don't have to start from the beginning. You bring a new animal, you slaughter it, and then do the sprinklings against the parochet. And if you spill the blood after that, then you do a new slaughtering, and then you do the ones on the inner altar. Okay? So what happened here was, Pigel bein b'rishona bein b'shniya bein b'shlishit means if each time between stages you spilled the blood and had to slaughter a new animal for the next stage, well, since each slaughtering and then each sprinkling of the blood basically like was a complete stage because they then were separate. Normally, the bloods are all considered one thing because it all comes from one animal that was slaughtered, and then you have to do all the bloods, right, for that animal. But if this time we're going to split it into stages, and first animal was for the first one stage, second animal was for the second, third was for the third, well, if you had a pigul machshava during the shechita of one of them, that would be a complete, okay, Rabbi Meir is going to say pigul, why? Dichab matirhu. It's a complete action. There's this shechita. Now, what's the idea with pigul again? It's again, this isn't that you're having a thought while the blood's being sprinkled. We move the thought now, the pigul thought, to the slaughtering. Now, what's the issue? You have to have a pigul from an entire action, right? A complete action. So you did it all during the shechita. It was an improper thought. And that permits one thing. Now, what did it permit in this? It permits something. In a regular case, the pigul of the shechita would permit all the bloods, okay? In this case, you had a machshava in the shechita which permitted stage one of the bloods because then you spilled the blood and then you needed a new shechita to permit stage two of the blood and a new shechita to permit stage three. So now, you might say, okay, now this is the question, okay? So, or maybe I shouldn't even jump the gun yet because the Gemara is going to ask. But so let me just say it very simply right now. Since even though, let's say it like this, even though there were three shchitas, but each shchita had a complete matir. It permitted something complete. It permitted, this shchita permitted that blood. So if you had a machshavet pigul in one of the slaughterings, that's going to be pigul for the right, for that blood. So now that blood is pigul, and that makes it pigul for the whole. Now all the meat's going to be pigul of that animal because there was something complete that has a beginning and an end. Meaning, what's the beginning? The beginning is the action that permits, and the second is the permitted action that was done. So the shechita permits the blood to go in the Kodesh Kodeshim, which it did. The next shechita permitted the blood to go to the parochet. It did. The next stage. So if at any one stage there was a pigul thought in the shechita, at any one of those animals, it would make the korban pigul. That's what this is saying. So now we're going to ask, what about chachamim? Okay? Ihachi my tamid Rabbanan. If it was one matir in the shechita, you can't say this is mefaglim b'chatzi matir. It was a complete matir. So why would the rabbis say this doesn't work? Right? This isn't pigul. So I'm a Rava, man chachamim. Who are the chachamim? Rabbi Eliezer, or maybe Rabbi Elazar. There's a deliberation who this is. Okay, the hagahot here say Elazar. Ditna. Hakometz v'halavona v'aktoret. Okay, so we're basically going to say we don't know yet what this is, but it's going to match Rabbi Eliezer's opinion or Rabbi Elazar's opinion, as appears in this Mishnah. The kometz, the lavona, the ktoret, the minchat kohanim, minchat kohen mashiach, minchat nesachim, shekriv me'achat mehem kezayit b'chutz chayav, Rabbi Elazar poter ad shekriv et kulan. Okay, what's going on here? These are all things, the Kometz, the Levona, the Toret, the Mincha of a Kohen, the Mincha of a Kohen Gadol that he would bring to every day, called the Mincha Chabitin, and the Mincha that goes along that goes along with the libations of every like of certain korbanot have Mincha Nisachim, right? Mincha Tam v'Niskehem Kibidubar, like we say in our davening. Those all are unique in that the entire part of it gets burned. Okay, so when you take the handful of the dough of the mincha offering, that's the kometz, and you offer it on the altar, you offer the whole kometz, right? Not the whole mincha, but that already you separate. You offer the whole kometz gets burned, the whole levona gets burned, all of the ketoret, when you do the incense, everything gets burned. Okay, a mincha of a kohen who does a voluntary meal offering has to completely burn. Kalil tiyeh, it says in the Torah. The mincha chavitin of the Kohen Gadol completely burned, and the mincha nesachim completely burned. Now, here comes the question. It needs to be completely burned. So what if I burned it outside the temple? Now that's forbidden. We learned already. You're chayiv if you, right? We've been learning that. If you take something outside the temple, you're chayiv. What if you took only a kezayit of it? Now you have to burn more than a kezayit. You have to burn the whole thing. Who cares whether it's an olive book or not? Well, Tanakam says you're chayiv anyway, because you're supposed to burn this on the altar. You burnt a requisite amount of it outside, on an outside altar, you're liable. Rabbi Eliezer says, or Rabbi Elazar, Ad she'akrivit kulan. No, since the mitzvah was, or the chiyuv, the obligation was to burn the entire thing, you're not going to be obligated unless you burn the entire thing. What does that have to do with our topic? Well, we're going to say, since in order to do the bloods here, what did you need here? You needed 3 different acts of slaughtering, right? You needed to slaughter animal 1, animal 2, and animal 3. Without animal 1, 2, and 3 being slaughtered, you can't do all the bloods because each animal, since you spilled the blood in between, each animal permitted certain blood. Now, we view that as each one is a whole independent unit. But what do you see here? No, just like a kezayit is not an independent unit of the kometz, even though theoretically a kezayit could be an independent unit, right? You're not going to be obligated there. So we're going to assume you're not going to be obligated here with the blood unless you had a pigul machshava in all 3 slaughterings. That's what we're going to say the rabbis are, and that explains the rabbi's position. What's the problem? It's very hard to say that Rabbi Eliezer would hold the same thing by us because you're making a jump. You're taking him talking about the kometz, the levona, all those things in burning something on an outside altar. And you want to move it to slaughtering to allow the blood to be spilled on the altar. So they say, Hama Rava Moder Rabbi Eliezer b'damim. Doesn't Rava say that Rabbi Eliezer or Rabbi Elazar admitted when it came to the blood, held like the other side? What does that mean? Ditnan. Rabbi Eliezer and Rabbi Shimon omrim, mimakom shepasak misham umatchil. Rabbi Eliezer, when it comes to the blood, he actually views each shechita for whatever blood needs to be done as an independent unit. And then that would go back and fit better with Rabbi Meir, and then you can't say that's the rabbi's position, because if you view it as an independent unit, then you're going to say, if you're shechita, you had a pigul machshava, it's going to basically be a complete action with that blood. Now, how do we know? What does he say? He says that if, let's say the blood spills, I gave an example where you spilled the blood after you did all the inner ones, and then after you did all those, and in between sets. What if you did it in the middle of a set? So the rabbis say you have to start from the beginning of that set. And Rabbi Eliezer and Rabbi Shimon say, no, wherever you are, let's say you did 2 out of the 16 sprinklings. So you start with number 3. Okay, you did 2 of the 11, 2 of the 7 or 2 of the 4. You start in the middle with your new animal. You just slaughter a new animal and just continue wherever you were up to. If he says you continue wherever you're up to, he obviously thinks that each one is kind of complete independent unit. Theoretically, I forgot where I read this, but someone said, theoretically, you could have 43 separate animals slaughtered here. And each one, right, according to the first one, you would have to have, the most you could have is 4. Because if you split up the first section, right, Kodesh Kodeshim Keneged HaParochet is 1, Heichal Neged HaParochet is 1, and then Mizbeach HaPnimi, you have the 4 and the 7. And then you could have 4 animals. But according to this opinion, you could have 43 and each one is viewed independently. So basically, he fits much more with Rabbi Meir and not with the rabbis. So you can't really explain the rabbi's position according to this explanation. Because if it's pigul b'shchita, we don't really have an opinion that says that that's not a complete independent unit with the bloods that went along with it. And it should be pigul, even if you hold emefaglim b'chatzi matir. So it's very hard to explain this according to Rabbi Meir. And therefore, right? What we tried to do is to say, according to Reish Lakish. Very hard to explain Rabbi Meir according to Reish Lakish here. Again, but this issue is focusing on not does he hold or not Kolo sel dat rishona ose, because this is not a dat rishona. It's Reish Lakish said he does not hold that mefaglim b'chatzi matir, right? And this looks like he does hold mefaglim b'chatzi matir because, right, he tried to say maybe it is chad matir because it's pigul b'shchita, but we couldn't really explain it that way. And then if you could say it was a complete action, then it would say, okay, mefaglim b'chatzi matir. He agrees. This is a whole matir. And then we'd explain it, but we can't really explain it that way because the rabbi's position doesn't seem to match anything we know. So second attempt, Ela Amarava. Kigon, now what we're going to do in this case is both Rava and Rav Ashi are going to try to bring it back to a case where there was a machshava and there was a silence, okay? Now you can't say it was pigul b'rishona and shatak b'shniya because it says, right, pigul bein b'rishona, bein b'shniya, bein b'shliut, there's 3 stages. So it can't be the same as the one we brought earlier. So we're going to have to add some, and also we know that already, so this must be adding something else. So Rav is going to say the following: Kigon shepigel b'rishona v'shatak b'shniya v'chazar v'pigel b'shlishit. So you had a pigul machshava in the first set of bloods, then you were silent in the second set, and then you had a pigul machshava in the third. And again, what are we going to say? Rabbi Meir says it's pigul because your silence follows the first. Okay, and then we don't have to worry about ein mefaglin or mefaglin b'chatzi matir because he views it as a whole matir because it's all just one continuum. Okay? Now, why is this any? And then the rabbis say, ein bokare, because you were silent. We don't rule your silence as if there was pigul. Silence means good machshava, not a pigul machshava. So the Gemara has to explain, though, what's different from this case and pigul b'rishona v'shatak b'shniya. Why do we have to bring this in addition? Well, Mao Detema, you might have thought, Isa kadata hadar rishona u'mahader pigul b'shlishi lamali. You might have thought, if you have a pigul machshava in your first, you have this mistaken intent, right? Incorrect intent, you're going to do something at the wrong time. And then you're silent. Okay, so you could say your silence follows, right? Must follow the first. But if you had intent in the first, and you had intent in the third, and you didn't have intent in the middle, well, why do you have intent in the third? If we hold that you just have to have intent in the first to say, this is my intent, and then just be silent the rest of the time. So you might have thought the fact that we have 1 and 3 and not 2, maybe that messes up, right? Rabbi Meir wouldn't say the same thing. He does say the same thing. He still thinks the second machshava follows the first. Okay? And the rabbis will say no, and that explains the rabbi's position. But as I told you, we're going to raise a difficulty with this. What's the problem? Midi shatak katane? It doesn't say he was silent anywhere. It says, pigel bein b'rishona, bein b'shniya, bein b'shliut. It sounds like any which one of them, and it doesn't sound like there's some particular order. This one you have pigul, that one you were silent, that one pigul. Definitely doesn't sound that way. And it doesn't say shatak in the middle one. This doesn't really work at all, according to the simple reading of this Tosefta. So option number 3. So that's matkev la Rav Ashi. I forgot to read those words. This difficulty was raised by Rav Ashi. Rav Ashi says, midi shatak katani, and doesn't accept Rav's explanation. So what does Rav Ashi say? Elam Rav Ashi, hacha b'mayaskin, on third attempt to try to explain this according to Reish Lakish, kigon shepigel b'rishona u'bashniya u'bashlishit. You have pigul in all 3 stages. We thought it was one or the other or the other. Now he says you have pigul in all 3 stages. Okay, so what's the chidush here? Well, ma'u detema isa kadata kol osel dat rishona oseh mehadar pigule b'kol chad v'chad alamali kamashmala. Now what you have to add here, which I forgot to say a minute ago when I read it, but you had a pigul machshava in the first, the second, and the third, but there's a 4th stage. Remember I said before you could view this as 3 or 4? Until now we kept thinking when it said 1, 2, or 3, it meant all the stages. But now we're going to say you had a pigul machshava in Kodesh Kodeshim Keneged HaKaporet, in the Holy of Holies. Then when you went out to this inner sanctuary, you did it against the parocha, you had a pigul machshava. Then you went to the inner altar and you did the 4 matanot and you had a pigul machshava. Then when it came to the very last stage, the 7 hazaot, on the top of the mizbeach, you didn't say anything. No machshava at all. Now, this is similar to what Rava said in the logic of it. Ma'u detema, you might have thought, Isa kadata kol osel dat rishona oseh mehadar piguli b'chol chad v'chad alamali. If you're going to say, just anytime you do something and then you're silent, your silence follows what you did originally. So why would this person specifically have a pigul machshava in stage 1 and 2 and 3 and not 4? Doesn't make sense, right? If you wanted to say, I'm doing this pigul and I want this thought to cover all of everything I'm doing, All you need to do is do it in the first. The fact that right, you did more, sometimes more is less, right? You did it in stage one, stage two, and you specifically didn't do it in stage four. Maybe that shows that you didn't have a pigul machshava in the fourth stage. Kamash malan, that's what Rabbi Meir says, no, no, no. I still view this as the fourth follows the earlier ones. Okay? And that's his chidush. But we're going to end turning now to Amabet with a difficulty. Vaha bain katane. Right? It says bain barishana, whether in the first, whether in the second, whether in the third. Okay, that's how you translate bain. Okay, bain this, bain that, either this or that or that. You can't say this means and this and that and that. If it wanted to say that, it would have said pigel barishona uba shnia uba shlishit. So this also doesn't match the language of the Tosefta, in which case we're left with a difficulty. So this was 3 attempts to try to resolve the difficulty against Reish Lakish from this Tosefta. And each one ended with a difficulty, and we're not successful in doing it. So now we're going to move back to the second stage so first stage of Gemara today, since where we started until already Amud Bet, is just trying to raise this difficulty against Reish Lakish's explanation. Now we're going to move to a difficulty against the opposite explanation. The one who says that the machloket between them is mefaglim b'chatzi matir or ein mefaglim b'chatzi matir. Now, I'm not sure why you're asking if Reish Lakish wins the day. He does. This is a difficulty against Reish Lakish. We can't explain Reish Lakish based on that Tosefta. We have a problem with Reish Lakish. And in fact, later we're going to have a problem with Reish Lakish as well. This difficulty we're going to raise on those who disagree with Reish Lakish is actually going to be resolved. So this is now quoting that line that we just saw in the Braita, okay, in this Tosefta, that it's Rabbi Meir omer pigul v'chayavim alav karet, okay? Michti karet lo mechayev. This is a bit of a difficult question, so bear with me. Michti karet lo mechayev ad shikruvu kol matirav. One other thing we know about pigul, okay, there's a lot of details to pigul, okay? Remember, the first is you don't get karet for your thought. You get karet when you eat the meat, right? And one of the other details is when you eat the meat later, you're only going to be liable to karet when you eat the meat if you actually, in the end, did the blood placements on the altar or spilling on the altar or throwing on the altar, whatever it might be. If you didn't do the sprinkling of the blood, okay, like let's say your pigul machshava is during slaughtering and you never went ahead and put the blood on the altar, that's what it's called ad sheyikrevu kol matirav. You have to do stage 1, 2, 3, 4. Shrita, kabbalah, holacha, and zrika. If you didn't do those stages, and you eat the meat of a korban that, let's say you slaughter the animal with a pigul machshava, I'm going to sprinkle the blood outside the time, and then you don't go ahead that day and sprinkle the blood, there's no karet if you eat the meat of that. Like let's say you barbecue up the meat tomorrow or the next day or whenever it is. It's not pigul, okay? Now, you shouldn't do it anyway, right? But you don't get karet for it. You're only going to get karet. So that's what we're going to say here. Michti karet lo mechayev ad shikruvu kol matirav. You have to go through those 4 stages and have the blood sprinkled. Really, the main thing is you have to have that blood sprinkled on the altar. Damar, how do we know this? And we saw this before. Kehartzaat kasher kachartzaat pasul. Just like a kosher korban is completed in doing those actions, also a disqualified korban is completed. It's a very weird concept, okay? In order for it to be pigul, it's very similar, and we learned this actually when we talked about this. If you have, let's say, a different reason to disqualify it, like you did a chutz l'mkomo, a different stage, or you did a lo lishma and a chatat and a pesach, also it wouldn't be pigul, right? Because everything else has to be perfect, meaning even completing the placements of the blood or the sprinkling of the blood, right? In order for you to get that karet for eating the meat later. So again, so kosher korban works the same way a disqualified korban works. Just like a good korban until everything is done. Okay, that's not so complicated. We learned that before. Here comes the tricky part. Since you had this machshava, let's say you're in the Kodesh Kodeshim, the Kohen Gadol is in there, sprinkles the blood with the wrong pigul machshava, and then comes out and does the rest the way they're supposed to go. So you would think that's yikrevu kol matirav, just like if I slaughter it for the wrong reason and then I sprinkle the blood, right? I sprinkled the blood, okay, now. But they say, no, this one doesn't work the same way. Why? Kiman de lo ade dami. Ade is from Dalet and Zion switch. It's aze. Aze from the lashon of haza'ah, sprinkling. It's as if you didn't even sprinkle it outside. Why? Ki hadar made behecha, when you go and do the sprinklings in the sanctuary, maya ba'almahu dekadi. You already disqualified the blood because you were in the inside and you did blood incorrectly. So the rest of the sprinklings of the blood, it's like you're sprinkling water. You can't call that yikrivu kol matirav because you disqualified the blood sprinklings. And therefore, it's like you're throwing water. And what's the problem with this? Commentaries ask this question. Rashi does a long, lengthy way of explaining it, and this is the part that's a little bit complicated to understand, is that why is this different than any korban? When you slaughter it, and then you bring the blood on the altar, it's also like you did nothing because you already disqualified the korban. So sprinkling the blood is like sprinkling water, right? It's no different, really. So you have to somehow explain that because this is within the bloods themselves. In other words, you had a pigul machshava while the sprinkling of the blood inside, and that ruined the blood outside, okay? In other words, here you have a split. If we view it as one unit, you've kind of ruined one, and then that ruins the rest of them. And then and what Rashi really says is like, it's very confusing. I'm going to try to explain it, but I find it very confusing. It's hard to explain something that's confusing. When you, let's say, do shchita, and then with a machshevet pigul, and then you do the sprinklings of the blood, your complete unit of sprinkling of the blood was done, and that's okay. Or let's say you have a pigul machshava during the sprinklings of the blood, but the whole time you're sprinkling the blood, you have the pigul machshava. Or let's say in the first, which was the only important one, if we're talking about the mizbeach hachitzon. So that's your blood was either done all properly or all improperly. It's like 100% bad or 100% good. That works, okay? But here you have sprinklings that were done with the pigul machshava, and then others that you kind of were doing without the pigul machshava, and then you ruined some, you did some the right way, but it's as if you didn't do any because you already ruined them inside. It's a bit of a weak answer, and we're going to see one of the ways to resolve this question is to kind of reject this theory. So I'm not going to go too much farther to try to explain something that's hard to really understand. But the idea being somehow there's a distinction between this one and the others because the bloods are kind of split. Okay? So what they're now going to say is it's as if you didn't sprinkle it, and therefore it's as if, how could you say this is a case of pigul? Okay, now, what we have to say here is, this is Rabbi Meir, right? So Rabbi Meir says it's pigul. Now, according to Rabbi Meir, though, if you had the pigul, again, in part of, that's the whole thing, mefaglim b'chatzi matir. Remember, we're going not according to Reish Lakish. The Rabbi Meir's theory right now is mefaglim b'chatzi matir. You can have pigul and half a matir. Well, if the half a matir is in the middle of the bloods on Yom Kippur, then you're going to have an issue because you had a pigul machshava, part of it. The other was done as if you were just sprinkling water because it wasn't done with pigul, and then that would have continued it. And it wasn't done without pigul. So now, but part of it was, you can't say that that's a good action. So, because you already did some of the blood with pigul, so you don't have yikrivu kol matirav. It's like you sprinkled water. So we're going to have two answers. The second answer kind of undoes the question, but the first one doesn't. I'm a rabba. Mishkachala, back to our crazy case. Ba'arba'a palim u'ba'arba'a sirim. It's a case where there's 4 bulls and 4 goats, meaning that each time you spilled the blood, and each stage was an independent unit. So the one, right? So now you have the ones that were done in the inner, let's say, were done with one animal. And then the next set of bloods was its own independent unit. That one, the first one you did completely pigul. The second one you did completely not pigul, or the reverse. And therefore, that actually would work. And then you could say, Yikrivu kol matira. Rava mar filu teim b'paracha v'sir echad lepigulo meratzeh. Okay, now this connects this with all the other cases of pigul. In other words, all you really need to do is, like we could say this with one par, one seer. You don't have to come up with a crazy case of the blood spilling. But even though theoretically it's like you're sprinkling water because you already ruined the korban, but just like in every other korban, once you do the shchita, let's say that was pigul, you're also just sprinkling water because the korban's already disqualified and you're just throwing water on the altar, even though it's blood, right? But it's not any significant blood because you've already ruined the korban. So likewise here, what does it mean, lepigul lo meratzeh? It just, you started with pigul, and now you just have to technically put the blood on the altar, and that will work to make it pigul. But in the end, when you eat the meat, it'll be pigul, and therefore, this isn't a difficulty at all. This isn't different than any of the others, and therefore, we've resolved the difficulty. So there's no difficulty here against the other opinion. Now, before we get back to the last difficulty on Reish Lakish, which we won't be able to resolve, we have a question about this 43. V'hatanya 47. Well, wait, there's a brighta that says 47. How did you get to 43? And the other brighta says 47, or how did they get to 47? Hakaman damar marvin lekranot, v'hakaman damar ein marvin lekranot. So let's go through again. We said 16 of 8 of the par, 8 of the seer inside, 16 again, 8 inside, 8 against the parochet of the bull, 8 of the goat. Okay, that's 32. Then we said you mix the bloods, and then you do 4 placements on the altar and 7 on the top of the roof of the mizbeach. But some people say you don't ma'arbev for the kranot. You don't mix the bloods at stage 3. You mix them at stage 4. You mix the blood after you did the 4 placements. So that adds another 4 placements. 4 of the bull, 4 of the goat. Then you mix them, and then you do the sprinkling of the 7. So that's the differentiation here. And Hatanya 48. Wait, somebody says 48. How'd you get to 48? Hakaman damar shirayim makvin, hakaman damar ein shirayim makvin. If you remember, we had a big debate. Is the remainder of the blood spilled when we take on all these chataot, we take the remainder of the blood and we spill it on the base of the altar. But is that essential or not essential? So if you say 48, then you say that's also essential. That's one place that you just take whatever's left and you pour it on the base of the altar. So if you hold it's essential, you'll get to 48. If you hold it's not, you'll get to 47 or 43. Okay, Meitive, last difficulty. Another Tosefta. This is Tosefta Menachot. Okay, now we're up to a case about, this is like the previous one we saw in yesterday's daf about pigul b'komets v'lo b'komets. That was a Mishna. Now we have a Tosefta on it. Now they're going to say, when is this true? B'kmitza b'matan kli u'b'hiluch. Okay, when is your pigul machshava going to ruin your mincha? If you do it during the 3 stages, which are like shchita, kabbalah, and halakhot. Now in the komets, there's no slaughtering, but taking the handful out, when the kohen takes the handful with his 3 middle fingers, if you have a pigul machshava during that action, that's like shchita, because you're kind of separating one from the other. Matan kli, then you put it in a vessel, that's the kabbalah, and hiluch, and walking it to the altar. So those 3 stages, if you had a pigul machshava, it would ruin your mincha. But when you get to the burning part, now we get to the part that's parallel to the Mishnah we saw. Natan et hakomets b'machshava v'et halevona b'shtika. If you did the komets with a pigul machshava, bad intent, and then you did the levona with no intent. Oh, now here, that's exactly what we saw in the Mishnah. But now they say, or shenatan et hakomets b'shtika. Well, first you put the komets on the altar to burn it with no thought at all. Then you did the levona with machshava. Then you had this pigul intent when you did the second stage. Rabbi Meir omer pigul v'chayvim alav kared, and chachamim say ein bo kared ad shepagal v'chol matir. You can't explain this machloket other than saying ein mefaglim b'chatzi matir or mefaglim b'chatzi matir is the machloket, because notice you can't say this goes by the first thought. The first thought was silence. The second thought was the one that was a problem, and yet Rabbi Meir says it's a problem. That's pretty clear. So, katani mia, so again, going back to the problematic line, they say even if you started silent and then went to the machshava, and they have a machloket, so Rabbi Meir must hold really bifaglim b'chatzi matir. He doesn't care if it's which half it is, any half, that also makes a pigul situation. 2 possible, so now they're going to answer this, but then we're going to have 2 rejections to this answer. Ema kfar natan et halevona b'machshava. Why don't you say that what it means is you put the komets with no thought, because you already, why is this going to be pigul? Because you already did the levona b'machshava before. Okay, that's obviously a very, hard to read for 2 reasons. So first of all, really it's one reason, but they're going to add another reason that you don't know. But chada dahainu reisha. First problem is, or hainu de reisha, it should be. This is the same as, remember, it gave 2 cases. You did the komets with a pigul thought, and then the levona with no thought at all. And then they switch the order, right? Now, they don't switch the levona and the kmitza, but they switch which is first and which is second, and that's obviously significant. So you can't say when it said, oh, but in the reverse case, which is actually the same as the previous case, that makes no sense. And ve'od, ha'tanya, there's a braita that says somewhere else, va'acharkach. It brings both these cases, and then it says, and if you did the komets with no thought, and b'shtika, with silence, and after did the levona, Rabbi Meir still disagrees. So you can't read it that way. Kashya. So this source really, this Tosefta really does raise difficulty with Reish Lakish's interpretation of Rabbi Meir. So again, it's a very simple summary, because we have a machloket. Does Rabbi Meir hold what he holds in that Mishnah Menachot because of he holds mifaglim b'chatzi matir? That's those who disagree with Reish Lakish. There is pigul even if you did it during just a part of the action. Okay? According to Reish Lakish, no way, no how does he say that. It's just that he was talking in that Mishnah about where you started off with the pigul machshava and you continued with no particular intent. And then we just say your intent follows the original. So we had two difficulties, if we summarize it, not in the order of the daf, but we had two difficulties against Reish Lakish, so we couldn't resolve. The first one we tried to resolve in three different ways, unsuccessfully, both, by the way, from Toseftas. And the second one we also couldn't resolve. Again, we resolved it each time, but had difficulties with the resolutions. And then we had a difficulty against those who disagree with Reish Lakish, and that one we actually resolved. With that, we finish for today. Wishing everyone a good week and a good day.